Give me a minute here to get set up and we'll get rocking and rolling. And if you're surprised to see me up here, I am also very surprised to be up here as well. When Will first sent me the email to say, hey, you want to teach? I was like, oh, that was sent to the wrong person for sure. So I didn't even sign up for 5 weeks because I didn't want to embarrass myself by signing up and then him saying, actually, that wasn't meant for you. So we're here. But yeah, I love the story that we are in today. If you've been reading ahead or reading as you're supposed to, we're learning about Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar today. I'm going to take this off because I like to move. I have a hard time sitting still. And I love the story because it confirms to me that the Bible is written about real people who are broken, making a total mess of things, and needing God to intervene on their behalf. And that's something I can very much relate to. So I don't know where you guys are at this morning, whether you are walking hand in hand with Jesus, which is awesome, if you're wrestling yourself with sin or doubting if God's good or if he's in your corner or if he loves you, or even if you're just questioning, hey, does God even exist? I'm happy that you guys are here with us this morning. So let me pray real quick because I'm going to make a mess of things if I don't, and we'll get going. So, Heavenly Father, I thank you for this morning, God. I just pray that you would use me in spite of myself, God, that it would be your words coming through and not mine. God, we thank you for who you are and that you love us deeply no matter where we are at in our walk. And I just thank you for this time this morning. I pray that you'd be with us. Pray in your name. Amen. Perfect. All right. So we had a really great kind of refresher with the Kovacs of kind of our main characters, but I just want to kind of go over them one more time just for fun. So we have a little slide here, and I kind of stole some pictures out of a Bible that some of the kids might be familiar with. So there we go. All right. So on your right-hand side, we have Mr. Abram. He's still Abram at this point. I might say Abraham, so give me some grace. I might be using those names interchangeably. And kind of what we know about Abram at this point is he's old. He's 85 years old. No offense to anyone in the audience. And he is kind of a mixed bag, which I think is a phrase that Tony used a couple weeks ago, which I really liked. Because he's had some moments of great faithfulness. It says at certain points that Abram's faithfulness was counted to him as righteousness. But he's also had some really big blunders that we've seen in previous chapters. And a little foreshadowing, today isn't one of his best moments either. But we also know at this point that he's pretty well off. Him and Lot have actually had to split and go separate ways just because they had accumulated so much that they couldn't even exist in the same land together. So they're pretty well off. And then kind of in the middle there, we have Sarai, who's also well along in years. And up until this point, we don't know a whole lot about her. The first time that she's introduced, it says, like literally, her name was Sarah, and she was barren. So I don't know how you guys like to have your main thing attached to you right there, but that's what we know about her. And then also the fact that she's been pretty faithful and loyal to Abram at this point. He has a lot of silly or ridiculous ideas. Silly is the kind way of putting it, and she has gone along with it up until now. And then lastly is a new character to our story, and that's Hagar. She is an Egyptian slave or servant. The Bible kind of says servant, but we'll kind of get the feeling that's a little bit more a slave. And the likelihood is we don't really know much about her, but it's likely that she was given to Abram and Sarah when they were in Egypt, and when it says Pharaoh dealt kindly with them, even though Abram kind of pulled the wool over Pharaoh's eyes there. And that's kind of all we know about her today. So before we kind of get into the main flesh of the story, I also want to review the promise that Abram has been given throughout this time, because it kind of sets the whole context of where we're going to be today. So these are just kind of some excerpts from previous in Genesis of the different times that this promise is talked about or provided to Abram. And the very first time we see it is when God calls Abram out of Haran and says, hey, go, and I'll take care of you, leave everything behind, and I got you. And he says, and I will make you a great nation. And then later, again, this is at the point when Lot and Abram are kind of going their separate ways. That promise comes up again, and he says, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth. And then Abram kind of time has passed, and Abram starts to doubt, and he says, God, I still continue on with no offspring. What's going on? Are you going to be upholding your promise? And this is what Micah talked about last week in chapter 15. It says, he takes Abram outside, and he says, hey, look up at the stars. Number the stars if you are able. So shall your offspring be. And that's kind of why we find ourselves this morning. So we're picking up 10 years after that first promise was made to Abram when he is first leaving Haran. And so let me make sure, I got to figure out a good rhythm for my notes here, otherwise I'm going to get butchered up here. Let me scoot this guy. We'll use the Bible, I promise, but I just need to set it down for a second. All right. So now our story is today picking up verse 10. And so we're going to be in Genesis chapter 16, verse 1 through 2. We are going to kind of be going through verse by verse. So if you have a Bible or a phone or whatever you want to use to follow along, we'll kind of get chugging here. So now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." So I love this passage because there's not any big old genealogy or any kind of like greeting message, just like right into the grittiness of it. But before we get too excited, I want us to kind of zoom out and I want us to understand a few things about the kind of cultural context of what was going on. So at this day and age, someone who is in Sarah's position, being a woman, childbearing was kind of everything. It was who you are. It was a woman. It was kind of the primary value that you brought to your family. It was synonymous with your identity. And so to shoulder this label of barren, being barren that Sarah had would come with an immense amount of shame. And it didn't just mean that you didn't have kids. It also have a lot of social insecurities that came with that, because after all, having children was also basically how your retirement fund, basically how you were going to be provided for in the future. So to be without children had lots of big implications for her. And so this proposition that she comes up, say, "Hey, go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her." This idea of surrogacy by slave or surrogacy by servant might be a little rightly unsettling to us, but I want us to kind of look at this picture real quick, and this is just to kind of get an idea of what was going on back in their time, the kind of the social norms that they were kind of steeped in, the kind of what society was doing around them. So this is kind of, is anyone able to read ancient cuneiform? No? Okay, all right. Didn't know if that was a CC elective yet or not. But basically, it says, this is basically a contract that was found in modern-day Turkey, right in Haran, kind of in that same area, and it was from the exact same time period that Abram was living. And basically, I'll summarize, is it says, hey, there's these two people getting married. The wife basically has 24 months. Once they get married, the timer starts ticking. She has 24 months to procure an heir for the husband. And if she doesn't, she is required to go out and buy a slave so that then the husband can have a child by that slave. After she provides the child, then you can do whatever you want with the slave. And so I don't say this as just a, hey, look at that, but I love this for a few reasons. A, I think it just gives us a good idea of what's going on in the time around them. It's not Sarah just flying out, coming out of left field, coming up with this proposition. I also really like it because it's a reminder that the Bible is a real story happening in a real place in a real time. And I love these little artifacts and things like that that kind of just confirm to us what's going on with that. So, let's see. Now, I want you guys to kind of put yourself in Sarah's shoes for a second. So she's been barren. She was 75 years at this when the story starts. So since the time that she'd be expecting to bear children, she hasn't been able to. Time and time again, the repeated disappointment, the repeated hurt of not being able to bear a child for her family, struggling with that kind of value and all that social pressure that's going on. So I imagine at this point, she's kind of accepted that station. Hey, having kids isn't for me. There's probably a level of acceptance of where she's at, even if she doesn't like it. But then her husband gets this crazy promise from God. God says, hey, I'm going to make your descendants greater than you can even count. And I think for a minute she starts to believe that. This little flicker of hope starts to be rekindled within her. And she gets excited, I think, if I had to be in Sarah's shoes. He comes home one night and says, hey, you'll never believe it. But then a couple years tick by, and Sarah starts to kind of go back to doubting again. A few more tick by, and then I think that what initially was hope is turned into bitterness, that God has not provided as he said he would. And ultimately what happens is Sarah starts to question, I don't even think I'm a part of this promise. I don't even think this was meant for me. And if you remember the promises that we just talked about, Sarah's never mentioned. That kind of assumption is not without basis, because the fact is that God never says, you and Sarah are going to have children. He's talking specifically to Abram every time. So ultimately, Sarah says, hey, this isn't for me. I want to make sure I nail my point. So Sarah says, this isn't for me. She kind of forgoes the plan that God has laid out for them. She begins to doubt God, doubt his ability to provide and his care for her. And in order to satisfy the longing for a family, she uses Hagar. And so this provides a good reminder to us. There are so many things in life that we long for, things that we feel like we deserve. Maybe that's a family. just like Sarah. Maybe it's a job that's able to provide for your family. Maybe it's a clean bill of health with no chronic conditions that you're having to constantly wrestle with. But whatever it is, if the longings of our hearts are not held in submission to God's provision and timing, we will seek a means outside of God to satisfy those desires. I'll read that one more time because this is kind of the main point from Sarah's section. If the longings of our hearts are not held in submission to God's provision and timing, we will seek a means outside of God to satisfy those desires. We see that that's exactly what Sarah does. She sought a means outside of God's provision and timing in the form of Hagar. And it says in Luke 9:25, it is worth nothing for you to have the whole world if you yourself are destroyed or lost. If we don't ultimately lay those longings at the foot of the cross, if we don't surrender those and seek our own means of satisfaction, it's ultimately going to come at the destruction of ourselves. And we so often happily accept the promises that God gives us, but we wrestle and writhe under his perfect timing to our own demise. And so kind of the question for you guys this morning, I'm just going to give us a second to think about it, is what longings do you need to surrender to God's provision and timing? Where are you trying to muscle it and do it your own way despite what God is doing? What longings do you need to surrender to God's provision and timing? So, kind of moving, there's a little structure that's going on here. There's a little method to the madness. So we're going to kind of talk about a main point from Sarah, then we're going to kind of look at Abram a little bit, and then we're going to go on to Hagar. So we've kind of, as we're wrapping up with Sarah, we're going to kind of jump over into Abram. So I want us to kind of look at how Abram responds, picking back up in verse 2 again. And it says, and Sarah said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram said, my dear wife, let us petition the Lord for wisdom and discernment in this matter. Let us hold fast, as the Lord has been faithful to us and will continue to be faithful to us. There's a little bit of laughter because Abram says none of that. That was just me inserting what should have happened. But Abram instead responds and says, yeah, okay, let's do it. And Scripture says, and Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And I don't know if that has when I was reading that, I had a little bit of a distant memory was tinkling in my brain. So I don't know if you guys remember earlier on in Genesis, this is the same language that God uses when Adam has sinned in the garden, when he has listened to the voice of Eve. And it says, because you listened to the voice of your wife, excuse me, and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, and that's kind of then the judgment is dealt out from that point. So we kind of both see that same word listen to there. And I just want to pause for a second before the pitchforks get sharpened. I'm no means endorsing that men should not be listening to their wives. If that was true in my house, everyone would be hungry, everyone's birthday would be forgotten, and our house would look like it should be featured on an episode of Hoarders. So definitely not what I'm endorsing, but instead these are both cautionary tales against listening to what we know to be bad advice, regardless of the source, regardless where it is coming from. The temptation to wander from God should always be confronted. So, Abram ultimately does what Sarah instructs. He ultimately, does what Abram instructs. I don't want to go into detail there. So, and Hagar becomes pregnant. Fallout then ensues within the household, right? Hagar gets a little high and mighty, she gets a new status, the fact that she's carrying this child, which everyone at this point thinks is the son of promise. Sarah realizing, hey, this plan sounded really good on paper, but now I've only been inflicted more hurt and more pain. And Sarah ultimately blames Abram, saying, hey, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between me and you and me. Yeah. And just that last little phrase, I like it, just fun fact. May the Lord judge between you and me would be a phrase that they would use in that time to basically endorse saying, hey, I've done nothing wrong here. It is entirely on you. It is entirely your fault, and God is going to see that. I don't know if that sounds familiar for any of you guys, but no. So Abram then takes no accountability. He says, hey, look, this isn't my problem. Look, that's your servant, your slave. You do with her what you want. Take care of business yourself. And ultimately what happens is it says, and Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. And so what I want to point out is that Abram is failing his family. He's falling short of the call placed on men that we find in 1 Corinthians 16:13, where it says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." And again, I really like this passage just because I think it's a very clear call. But also, curiously enough, you see that word watchful. That word only appears in 2 other times in the Bible. One other time it's talking about prayer, and obviously we should be actively and diligently praying for our family. But in the other verse, the other passage, it says, this is the passage, it says, "Be sober-minded." This is 1 Peter 5:8, by the way. "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." And I think if we hold these 2 verses together, it gives us a really clear and vivid picture of the call to men, to lead their family away from harm, to walk firmly in their faith, and be prepared to do combat with the lion, which is seeking to devour them and their family members. Abram is largely absent from the story, and I think that's exactly the problem. He has 2 opportunities. We kind of see that. We saw the first one. We're going to see another one. 2 opportunities for a familial course correction. He could have encouraged his wife in the midst of her doubt. He could have spoken a hard truth. He could have consulted the Lord, but instead he sits on his hands. He cowers. He's absent. He takes the path of inaction. And what Abram shows us is that when we choose inaction in the face of sin, it leaves your family vulnerable to the devil, the lion. And I realize I have a spelling error in my slide, and I'm sad about that. So I'll read that again. Inaction in the face of sin leaves your family vulnerable to the devil, the lion. So my question for you this morning is, where is your inaction leaving you or your family vulnerable to the lion? Where are you sitting on your hands in the midst of sin? Where are you knowing that there should be something done about this, or you should be taking responsibility for something, or kind of starting on a new path, but you're choosing to sit it out, sitting on your hands, putting your head in the dirt? So now we're going to kind of mosey along. We're going to jump into the segue into the climactic end of our story. So at this point now, we have Hagar is on the run. Sarah's kind of whomping on her at home. She's like, "I'm out of here. I'm not hanging with that." She's kind of on the road, and she's basically trying to make her way back to Egypt, which would have been a perilous kind of journey to take as a pregnant woman by herself. And so she has this encounter with a mysterious character in Genesis 16:7. That's where we're picking up. If you want to go back one slide. Thanks. So I have a burp or something that wants to come out, but I'm not sure what's going to happen. All right. Okay. So the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, and the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai." So I want to remind you for a second. Just remember Hagar, the fact that she is Egyptian, she is a slave, she is a woman. She probably doesn't believe in in our God, the God that Abram worships. And she's kind of the last person that people reading the Old Testament in this time would expect God to take an interest in. But he does. Hagar is alone, she's abused, she's taken advantage of, and God himself meets her right where she is at. And we worship a creator who chooses to come down to us, wherever we are at. And nowhere else is that more prominently displayed than in the person and the death and life of the resurrection of Jesus. And I love the first word out of the angel of the Lord's mouth is Hagar. He calls her by name, something that Abram or Sarah or nobody else does in the whole passage, the whole chapter, except the angel of the Lord. And I think immediately it shows a different level of care, a different level of value, a different level of regard. And I just love that. So picking back up in verse 9, the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And then he kind of goes on to kind of lay out all these blessings. Hey, you're going to have a son. You're going to call him Ishmael because the Lord has seen you and seen you in your affliction. And then also basically there's a little kind of verse that says he's not going to be a slave. Just like you are a slave, but he is going to be a free man, but he's going to kind of live in conflict with the brothers around him. And so ultimately, Hagar responds, and so she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." Another translation says, El Roy, the God who sees. "You are a God of seeing," for she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." So I want us to each sit and revel for a moment. The fact that the God of the universe, the God who holds the stars in the sky, the God who has created everything around us, sees you and knows you, not just as a passing friend, but he knows you intimately and by name. He is El Roy, the God who sees me. He knows our hopes. He knows our hurts. He knows our heavy burdens. He knows the pain that we have suffered at the hands of other people, the pain that we have brought on ourselves. And none of this is forgotten or overlooked by him because he sees us. And while I wish we could just sit here for the rest of the morning and steep ourselves in that truth, the fact of the matter is that we have kind of skipped to the end. We've fast forwarded a little bit. Because the very first thing that happens, the very first thing that the angel of the Lord tells Hagar is not the blessing of what's to come, but it's the call to obedience. It says, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." God calls Hagar into the painful circumstances, into the uncomfortable situation that she was trying to flee. And he doesn't tell her like, "Oh, okay, and I'm going to make it all right because I changed Sarah's heart, and then Abram's going to really care for you, and you're going to have a bunch of money, and everything's going to be great." No. He doesn't give her any explanation. He just calls her into obedience despite discomfort. And Hagar responds in obedience with joy to God's command and returns to Sarai. Because she believes that God is faithful to deliver the promise that he has provided. And she has a hope of things of yet to come. We love to be comfortable. At least I do. And we love it so much, we've even created a little special zone called our comfort zone that we don't like it to be infringed upon. But the reality is that we are not guaranteed comfort, at least the way that we think of it. And just as Hagar is placed in and called back to a place of discomfort, God often calls us or has us in places of discomfort. Our response, just like Hagar's, should be one of obedience. Because how much greater a promise are we secured by? How much greater a hope? We have a promise that extends beyond this world, a greater promise than simply for our earthly desires to be met, a promise fulfilled in the promised one, Jesus Christ. And so as we wrap up, my hope, actually I skipped. There we go. Thank you. That's why we have slides. So the question for you guys is, where are you prioritizing your comfort over obedience to God? Where are you prioritizing your comfort over obedience to God? I got too many things to list on that list. So as we wrap up, I hope is that as we take these lessons to heart and that we walk in obedience. I think I have one final slide, maybe. Perfect, there it is, all right. As we walk in obedience, as Hagar did, as we take action against sin as Abram should have, and we trust in God's perfect timing and provision, which Sarai failed to do, we should know that we are fully seen by our wonderful Creator. Would you guys pray with me? God, we thank you for this morning. We thank you that you are a God who sees us wherever we are at, God, even in our plights, God, even in the high highs and the high lows, that you see us, that you love us, God. And we thank you for the great promise, God, that all promises are fulfilled in your Son, Jesus Christ, God. And we just thank you for this morning. We thank you for this congregation. We thank you for the opportunity to gather and just learn about you openly and freely, God. And I pray that we would be walking in obedience, God, that we would be waiting upon your perfect timing. And that whatever longings or desires of our heart, God, even if those are good and right and true, God, that those would be ultimately held in submission to you, God, we thank you for this congregation, God. And we thank you that you love us regardless of ourselves. And we pray in your name. Amen.